Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everybody. As some of you may know, over the past couple of years, I've done several webinars and video lectures on a variety of topics that also come up on this podcast. There is unfortunately a lack of qualified therapists who specialize in working with cult survivors and their concerned family members. And since I can only see a finite number of clients myself, I wanted to share insights from my 30 plus years of doing this work with as many people as possible. So, in pursuit of that goal, I've made all of my recent video lectures available on my website, rachelbernsteintherapy.com. You can find a link to the page in the show notes of this episode. There you'll find my lecture from the most recent conference of the International Cultic Studies Association, my, quote, Living in Freedom, unquote, series for survivors and their family members, and my recent lecture entitled Why Did I Stay?, which examines the many reasons that people have difficulty leaving high control groups. We plan on adding more video lectures in the near future, so if you have topics you'd like to hear me cover, please feel free to reach out to us and make suggestions. Hi, everyone. I know there is always a lot happening around the world and a lot, I'm sure, on people's minds. There have been a lot of natural disasters also, and earthquakes with tsunami warnings and things happening. I am also here in Los Angeles, right outside an evacuation zone from the LA fires. I know people who have lost everything and who are still trying to locate their pets that they had to leave behind when they had to run because they couldn't find their pet in time before they had to evacuate. If there's any way that you want to be able to help the people out here who really are suffering, you can check online for ways to support the rescue heroes, the firefighters and others, and for people who are evacuees, as well as all of the shelters taking in small animals to large. A lot of people living in areas where they had horses. And so any help would be wonderful. And we'll post a couple links to reputable places to send money to in the show notes and to send aid and support and supplies. Thank you very much. For this week, we have a special guest, Nicole Badera. She is a sociologist and author of the forthcoming book On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. Her research broadly focuses on how our social structures contribute to survivors' trauma and make sexual violence more likely to occur in the future. Her scholarship has influenced sexual violence prevention programming across the country, including for Planned Parenthood, and her work has been featured in many popular outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, Time Magazine, and Teen Vogue. Nicole puts her work into practice as an affiliated educator at the Center for Institutional Courage and as a co-founder of Beyond Compliance Consulting. It's important to have subjects like this covered on a show like IndoctriNation. It is about influence. It's about coercion. It's about people who have been victimized not being supported, not being protected by the system around them. It's so much like the cult stories we hear, and that a lot of people are made to feel within cultic systems that they brought things on themselves, that it's somehow a punishment, just like within the legal system, how so often the victims of sexual violence are blamed for the violent attack on them. Well, what were you doing there, and why were you wearing that, and why were you walking in the dark, as though somehow those things are an invitation to a crime and justification for a crime. And so every once in a while, we're going to be branching out on this show to cover the subjects that have a different feeling to them, but the same themes. You can find out more about Nicole and her work at www.nicolebedera.com. Here's Nicole now. I am really happy to be speaking with Nicole Badera today. This is a subject that has actually been on my mind for many years, and it is fascinating to see how my work and the podcast branches into so many things that have spoken to my heart. No wonder I'm in this field. I've just seen so many things that have been able to be tied into indoctrination, in control, powerlessness. A whole system seems to be working against you, protecting the wrong people. And so it's really not only good, but important that you're coming on this show to educate people on it about what is speaking to your heart right now and probably has for quite some time. So I'd love you to take a moment to introduce yourself and then we'll start talking.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I think there's so much overlap between sexual violence within organizations and sexual violence within cults. They use a lot of the same tactics. Survivors often feel a lot of the same pressures. So I'm so excited to be having this conversation. To introduce myself a little bit, I got into this work over a decade ago now as a victim advocate in the criminal justice system. I was meeting with survivors in the immediate aftermath of their sexual assaults during their forensic exams, or you might know them as a rape kit. And in that role, I was encountering a lot of the same stories for different survivors and a lot of the same questions from them, where they would ask, why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? Why do people perpetrate this? And then this question of why are people being so unsupportive? Why am I being treated this way when I'm trying to get help? And at the time, there weren't a lot of great answers in the research. There were a few researchers doing some incredible work, but a lot of the academic work would blame the victim, would say, here are all the things that you did that put you at high risk. And if you would do these things differently, this won't happen to you again. And it just didn't make sense to me, considering how different the survivors were from each other and how differently they managed their sexual assaults, but they still ended up in the same place. They still ended up in the hospital with me. And so I went to get a Ph.D. and study sexual violence. I kind of fell into studying campus sexual violence. At first, it was because when I did my first research, I was an undergrad. I didn't have a lot of resources, didn't have a lot of money. And so I needed to do something nearby. And then this discussion about campus sexual assault blew up in the national discourse the next year. And I stuck with it. And the reason I've decided to stick with it is not so much because it's politically charged, but because our schools are the place that teach the most privileged adults in our society what is normal in adulthood. What type of violence is acceptable, who can perpetrate it, who cannot, who should be a victim, how they should behave, whether they can speak out or whether they need to be silent. And so that's how I ended up doing this work. And so that's what we're here to chat about today is my research about with victims, perpetrators, and school administrators about what happens when victims try to come forward.
Okay, so it's something that I come across so often that is so maddening because I think it makes people who hear these stories feel very hopeless about there being a system in place that's going to be watching out for them. And also they can feel hopeless about ever getting any kind of protection or even sympathy if something were to happen with them because they see how other people were responded to. It feels to me like this very weak, weaselly way of responding. Like, let's just turn it all around and blame the victim. Then we don't actually have to change the system. We don't have to really define consent in a better way. We don't have to actually find other ways of shifting a system as it is, because that makes us tired. That's what it feels like to me, right? And so I feel like, because people just don't want to do that kind of work and change things and go up against even universities where they might be against the benefactors and, the administrators and, oh, forget it, it's too much work. But I also hear it almost daily from people raised in Bible-based cultic groups. The woman is blamed. The woman is the kind of the siren, who has pulled the ships to the shore and made them crash. Like, it's all the woman's fault for having been something, I don't know, walking a certain way or just breathing the way she was breathing. And then there's this whole new age thing that we come across where, like, the large group awareness trainings, the EST landmark forum, all those things will, and Scientology too, they'll talk about, that you brought it in, that, what did you do to trigger this? And you have to look at yourself as being responsible for everything that happens to you, which then becomes this whole large group awareness training kind of, I think, permissiveness. It's like, then it becomes a playground for perpetrators. Like, oh, good. I'm glad they're teaching that the victim has to look at themselves because, well, that's very cool for me to know. And I can just do whatever I want to do and not have punishment and not even have to feel remorse because no one's going to be calling me on anything.
Right. That's exactly right. And, that actually brings me to the first project I ever did, even before the book. And so this was the very first thing I ever did is I looked at the way university campuses provided sexual assault prevention tips on their websites, which are required by law. Unfortunately, since we know that most of those tips tend to, I found in my research, blame the victim. And so what I did is I looked at all of these different school websites. I pulled off all of the prevention tips that they had given to women, and I put them all in one place. And I did a thematic analysis to say, what are these tips? And one of the things that I realized is that if you could not possibly follow all of them because they were contradictory. So the most obvious example is never be alone, but also don't trust strangers. And so if you move to college and you are no longer in your hometown, every single person there was a stranger. So you can't do both. And it creates these traps for victims where no matter what you're being told, no matter what they want you to do, you can't possibly meet their expectations. Instead, you're going to be blamed. There's always a reason to blame the victim. And I want to get into what you're saying too about the institutions and the organizations not responding appropriately, because that's a really big deal as well. There's this fantastic article that unfortunately is super paywalled, so I'll just tell you what's in it. But it's called The Sociology of Gaslighting by a researcher named Paige Sweet. And one of the things that she found for victims of intimate partner violence is that one of the reasons they can't get out and one of the reasons that they struggle to get help is because when they go to the police, when they go to their school, when they go to whatever other institution, they are blamed in the exact same ways that their perpetrators blame them. So their perpetrator will say, if you go to the police, they won't believe you. Or if you are undocumented, they might try to deport you. And then when victims go to the police don't believe them. Sometimes if they're undocumented, they might face deportation. All of these things are real. So the perpetrator, even though they're the one who's causing harm, they're the one who is the problem, they're the one who is violent, victim blaming so saturates our culture, so saturates our organization, that the perpetrator can really lean on these organizations to give legitimacy to their abuse. Because once the perpetrator's been proven right, that if you go to the police, you'll be blamed, well, now what else might you believe that they say? Will you believe the abuse is your fault? Will you believe that you're the one who needs to be more compliant or more submissive? It opens up the legitimacy of the abuse. And it's so much more than just two people in a power dynamic together. It's the power dynamic of the culture and all the institutions too.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And knowing also that there are all these issues around statute of limitations and that it takes so long for someone to feel brave enough to come forward, often after having been dismissed or told that it's healthier for them to forgive, or being dealt with people who just don't want to have to deal with it. And so it's easier just to blame the victim, or the toxic positivity. Like you were saying, like, oh, somehow it's for you. And, you should feel grateful for something. I don't even quite know what. I'm curious, to hear from you about sort of how you got started in this and what spoke to you about it and what you've noticed over time, if things have changed, if they haven't. I mean, I'm sure there's still a lot more work to be done, but has there been any improvement in awareness? So just to talk about what draws you to it and what you've seen.
That's such a tough question to answer right now because I think that we're facing dual pressures, that in some ways we're making a lot of progress. And in other ways, the backlash is really swift and really strong. And so in this moment, it feels a little hard to make a definitive statement about are we moving in the right direction or are we not? I think one of the things that feels like it's moving in the right direction, I was really drawn to this work because when I was a college student, which wasn't that long ago, by the way, I started college in 2010. I graduated in 2014, so 10 years ago. But when I came to my college campus, the conversation that we got about campus sexual assault at first year student orientation was the dean of students standing on the stage telling us that there had not been a rape on campus in 10 years, which was a lie. And the longer I was on campus, I started doing this work as an activist first and as a student organizer first. And the longer I was on campus, the more I heard stories from my friends about times they had gone to that dean of students and told him that they had been sexually assaulted and that he had dismissed them. He hadn't believed them. He didn't think of it as sexual assault. And so things look different on campus now than they did then. Now, at a lot of schools, there's an acknowledgement that campus sexual violence is a real problem, that there are victims who need support. But the place where it feels like we're still getting stuck, and the ways that sometimes I think it's gotten a little bit worse, is now this entire apparatus has been created in Title IX offices that's really focused on the privileges of the accused. That's focused on protecting their, they would say due process. I would say that is a weaponization of the phrase of due process. They're really focused on finding ways to give perpetrators impunity for what they've done. And I think one of the things that's been most shocking to people about my book are the cases where the sexual assault is undeniable. Because what our schools have told us is we want to do the right thing. It's just so complicated. It's so hard to know what really happened. It's so hard to know what the right thing to do is. And when you read a lot of these cases in the book, I imagine you'll feel the same way I did, which is that they are not complicated. It is not unclear if a sexual assault occurred. It's very clear that it did. And the complexity is being orchestrated. It's being created. This is a concept by a researcher named Jackie Cruz, that this complexity is created to really help us rationalize doing nothing in the face of violence. It helps us justify an action as individuals and as institutions. And so now when victims try to come forward, the part that feels worse is now, yes, there's somewhere to go. The school recognizes that this is something you might have experienced and you might need help in your academics, an extension on an assignment, something like that. But also, if you try to make the campus safe and you want your perpetrator removed and you want that to be a place where you don't have to look over your shoulder, you don't have to be afraid of running into them. Now, universities are much more sophisticated in the ways that they will shame victims, the ways that they will betray victims, and the ways that they will make victims feel like they did something wrong by coming forward. And so I think we're getting a mix. One of the things that I tell my students a lot is that everybody is opposed to sexual assault. Everybody knows rape is wrong until they know and love the rapist. And as soon as the perpetrator has been identified, that support for victims slips away. And I think that is maybe the best way to think about these dual forces. That if you are a victim who goes to your friend today and you say, I am in an abusive situation, I am hurting, I need help, if you don't name your perpetrator, you will probably get support. Whereas in the past, you might have gotten a lot of, well, why don't you do this? Why did you do that? How did you end up in this situation? I think we are making some progress on that front. But if you name your perpetrator, you might face a more intense backlash than I have seen before in my years of doing this work.
That's really interesting. It's reminding me of this case that I'm sure you've studied to a greater degree, because I just read an article about it, about this guy on a college campus where he raped someone or maybe more than one person, but the judge in the case didn't want to ruin his future because he had a promising future.
Oh, is this Brock Turner?
Oh, yes. Yes.
I talk about that case in the book.
Yeah, right. And I thought, wow. And what about the people that he attacked? What about their future? What about them being able to sleep through the night, ever? And just the betrayal, because it's that is such an act of betrayal, which is really unconscionable.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly the dynamic that I'm getting into, because that's what I found from school administrators, that the way we maybe have theorized the betrayals of a Title IX office and what would be unfair or illegal would be if the Title IX administrators, if school officials said something negative or sexist towards women and towards victims. And they don't do that as much as they used to. But the thing that they do still do is preserve protections and privileges for men. And this is not specific to Title IX. This is, in sociologists, we call this the stalled gender revolution. We think this is why feminism has stalled out, which is that we are pretty comfortable in our society with giving women more power and privileges to a degree. But with men, we're not comfortable with stripping away their power and privilege, including things like their power to perpetrate sexual violence. We still think of that as unfair, as being mean, as man-hating, as all of these different things. And so that's the way school administrators would talk about it too, the exact same as the judge in the Brock Turner case. They saw themselves as the defenders of young men's future, and they would create, or legacies, I should say that, the defenders of their futures for young men, or legacies for professors. The idea that their legacy, since they were older, the tarnishment could never be taken back because they were out of time to reinvent themselves, was also something that came up. But there was this presumption that when victims came forward, they were ruining lives, and that it was up to the Title IX office, which is supposed to be about gender equity, which is supposed to be about nonviolence and anti-violence, that their job was really to make sure that these men were going to be okay. And I say men intentionally because when the people who were accused were women, they didn't get the same kinds of protections. And that's especially alarming because when women were accused through these processes, it was almost always in something called a retaliatory complaint, where the victim was the woman was the person who experienced real victimization, real violence. They reported, but to confuse investigators, perpetrators would file a second complaint to say, actually, I'm the real victim here. And then school administrators will say, well, we have both people saying they're the victim, so we can't tell. And even in those cases, they tended to still side with the man. And when the woman was the one who was facing this kind of retaliatory complaint, she wasn't getting the same concerns about due process. She wasn't getting the same concerns about how could this affect your life. A lot of the time, the women were being removed sort of outside of the Title IX process altogether, being pressured into withdrawing from school. And so I say men really intentionally here. But that really is the crux of it, is this idea of we need to protect this valuable man, that he is the most important person in this process. This process is about him. And in many ways, this mimics our criminal justice system, which, for people who don't know, if you're a victim and you go to the criminal justice system, they don't take your side. You won't be a party in the case. You'll be evidence in the case. You'll be objectified into evidence in the case. You won't get a say necessarily over how the case goes. And, states do try. They have policies and procedures in place to try to not move forward with the case against a victim's will, but it does happen sometimes. And that's sort of how Title IX is viewing things too, which is that the victim is just evidence in a story about the perpetrator. And that's a lot of the coverage about these cases that do make the news are the same way. The victims are forgotten. There's a list of however many names at the beginning of the article, or maybe they're kept anonymous, which is often for the protection of the victim, and that's a good thing. But ultimately, we still end up with a scenario where everybody can name these high-profile perpetrators. Everybody knows who they are, and they become more famous. They get more notoriety. They often get more support, more power, and more privilege in society. Whereas the victims are forgotten. They're treated like a side character. And I think that so much of how to do better is to treat the victims as the center, that they're the ones who, I just want to think about perpetrators less. This is something I think is different from me, from a lot of other people who do this work. I'm kind of agnostic about what happens to the perpetrators. As long as they lose the powerful position that they use to perpetrate, I don't really care what happens to them after that. What I care about is that we can retain the survivors and that we're focusing on meeting their needs, and that we're taking all of our energy and our resources and giving it back to the victims to compensate for that harm and try to make it so their whole lives don't unravel as the result of what they've experienced. That's one of the most striking things to me about this work, is we talk about it in these individual contexts. We talk about violence as trauma. Or we talk about how if it's at a school, it might disrupt your schooling. But one of the things I found is that the entire life unravels. Even though the violence might have happened at a school, the school is also your dorm. So it's your home, which is your meal plan. You might be getting your health care from the university hospital. It's everything falling apart at once. And that's the thing I most of all want to stop. I want to make it so that when a victim decides to leave, to come forward, to seek help, that we make it so that at a bare minimum that the violence is the worst thing that happened. And right now, when victims come forward, the violence often is the beginning of months or years of their life where everything is falling apart. And that's the part that is in our control. We don't even have to convince perpetrators to stop offending to change that. So that feels like that should be the easy job. And instead, it's the harder one. It feels backwards.
Yes, it does feel backwards. It is backwards. And I think there's also something about women being believed. And again, I guess I'll say it in a gendered way because of percentages, but I do know it also happens to men. Women haven't been believed for millennia about having physical symptoms, about having endometriosis, about having things that, right? I mean, it's all in your head. It's all in your head. You're being hysterical because you have a uterus. And then I think here too, a lot of women are just sort of dismissed as trying to get back at a man for something or whatever it is, or just trying to be dramatic, trying to make trouble where there wasn't any. So we already have that. That's just part of mainstream. And just to be taken seriously is an extremely hard thing to do because I know a lot of women are taught you have to seem very calm, but also relatable. And you can't be overly emotional, but you can't be under emotional. Like you have to present it just right. There's just so much pressure to get it just right afterwards, just so you're taken seriously.
That was a big theme in the book. From all three types of participants, that was a big theme, is that women are crazy. And for victims, it would come up as exactly what you're describing. They would come to interviews with me with physical evidence, with text messages, with emails, with all of these things they wanted me to be able to see for myself because they felt like they wouldn't be believed. And they felt like they wouldn't be taken seriously. They wouldn't be seen as credible unless they brought me physical evidence. And realizing that for a lot of them, this is how they were trying to convince their friends and family to take their sides as well and to understand they'd experienced violence, which I just want to sit with for a minute how damaging that is. That when you experience violence, instead of getting support and care right away, that you have to prove you deserve it is it's a harm that deepens the trauma so much. And that's how I would see it from the victims, is trying to prove, no, I'm not crazy. No, I'm not crazy. Look, this really happened. And some of the victims would say that once they had been told over and over that what happened to them wasn't a big deal, or it shouldn't be traumatic, or wouldn't other people not care, that some of the victims literally went to the point of saying things like, I want to put a camera up in my house because I want proof the next time something happens. And unfortunately, the reality is that people can see this stuff happen to women and they'll still think it's not a big deal, which I think is at the core of it. That brings me to what the administrators were saying, right? So the administrators, when they would bring up this trope of hysteria, and they never use that word, but that's the word I use in the book because of the very legacy you're talking about. The administrators would say things like, I believe she believes she was assaulted. And sometimes, right, it's outrageous, it's gut-wrenching. And sometimes they would even say that they believed an assault occurred, but that they would think that the victim was overreacting. And they would try to come up with these reasons why actually the violence was okay and that it wasn't such a big deal. And they would do things that I think we get stuck in these gendered traps, because they would do things like say, if the victim has experienced abuse before, maybe they weren't sexually assaulted this time, maybe they were triggered. And that to me felt like the most violent weaponization of the work of feminist anti-violence advocates, that we are laying out all of the ways that we've been harmed, that women over generations have been harmed, and that they would use that language to say, you're harmed so much, who can you really blame for it? Which is what a lot of women, whether it's in, reporting sexual violence to their school or the criminal justice system, or trying to get help with a doctor, hear all the time, which is, there's so much wrong with you. How can you blame one person? our society is collectively failing women. It's unfair that one person would be the one who has to take the brunt for that. But that's just a way of absolving all of it, of absolving all of the violence and saying, once it's started, you're sort of damaged goods. It's too late to come forward. And that was really a thinking behind the school administrators. Is I would say they did believe the victims. They just didn't think the victims were being reasonable. They would just sort of assume, like, if I went through this, I wouldn't care. And I think that's a big assumption. I don't think it's true. I think a lot of the times, I know a lot of the administrators were victims themselves, trying to distance themselves emotionally from the victim in front of them, and that they were repeating victim blaming comments that have been made to them, right? And so, yeah, it played a huge role. And then, of course, you have the perpetrators who in interviews are calling their victims crazy, psychotic. In one interview, a perpetrator, the interview lasted about 100 minutes, and he used the word psycho about his victim over 30 times. And so it's this entire ideology that women are not trustworthy narrators of our own experiences, that we need a rational, reasonable man to tell us what really happened, and that our traumas are self-inflicted. It's us overreacting to things that men are doing that's supposed to be totally fine. And that really is at the core of all of the ideologies, of all of these conversations about sexual violence. It's this idea that since men have decided that it's okay to treat women this way, and that's what researchers find, by the way. It's not that men don't know that they're acting violently. It's that they know they're doing something harmful, but they think it should be okay. That's what I find in my research. I've done research with men in the past about how they define consent, how they define sexual violence, and this phrase that kept coming up was, it's not rape, it's just non-consensual. Which, as feminists, we would say, any non-consensual sex is rape, and they're making these artificial distinctions to say, yes, there's a line at which we think it's gone too far, but everything that I do, well, that's not sexual assault. And when that's the terrain we're working in, where the victims who've experienced violence are being treated as equal and as equally credible to weigh in on things like what sexual violence is, as someone who says, well, if I've done it, automatically it must be okay because I think I'm a good person. I don't think I'm a perpetrator. I don't want that label. Then it's not surprising that where we end up is consistently moving more and more and more towards thinking that most sexual violence is normal, it's fine, it's okay, and it's just something that women in the society are supposed to endure.
It is so maddening. It's so maddening. And so I'm wondering if you feel like this issue is really on its own here in this category, because I'm thinking, like, if I decided to rob a bank and they have it on surveillance that I robbed a bank, I would never expect that I could go into court and say, well, that's on them because they didn't have, enough security, clearly, because I was able to get in, and they weren't trained well enough to stop me because I was able to get cash. And you didn't have surveillance everywhere, so that's on you. And that, a judge and jury would go, yeah, no, she has a point. And so I guess she's innocent and the bank is guilty. But really? Look, I just don't know where else this happens except for when it comes to crimes against women. I don't mean to be saying something that might not be true, but I just haven't heard about it in any other
No,
form.
I think it is true.
Okay.
I think it is true. The only other examples I can think of are other cases of discrimination where, we see it with cases involving race discrimination or disability discrimination, especially in the Title IX office. A lot of schools, those are the same people. The Title IX office is also the Title VII office, is also the ADA office. And so the administrators who work in those offices will treat anybody coming forward to them about discrimination and about violence the same, no matter what is motivating it, right? That's the only example I can think of. But when you think of all of these other less power-laden, less inequality-based acts of violence or crimes, you're right. We don't think about it the same way. On a school campus, this is one of the things I say at the very beginning of the book. If a straight man punches another straight man on campus, it's much more likely to be resolved quickly, without any victim blame, and the perpetrator is very likely to be expelled, and nobody will be bending over backwards to say, this is so unfair. And some of it is even down to the policies and procedures themselves. So in this country, we have a different set of rules for how campus discipline needs to be managed when it involves sexual violence. And the perpetrators of harm get additional privileges that they would not get if they did something else. So the example that people use all the time is plagiarism, is that if a student plagiarizes on their paper, they don't have this quote unquote right to due process. The right to due process on college campuses is extremely limited in every other setting. The only thing the school has to do is tell you that they have a campus policy in advance. So it has to be written somewhere. So you have your student conduct, code of conduct, right? And they have to tell you that they think you violated it and tell you what the violation is. And they have to give you some chance to respond. That's it. Those are the only due process rights that we've had on college campuses. Compare that to this entire apparatus that has built around Title IX, which now says things like you can't place a perpetrator on an interim suspension because that would be unfair to them until the investigation is over. And actually, we have to have investigations. We don't require that for anything else on campus, but for sexual assault, we do. And you need to look at the credibility of the victim and, all of these different requirements that have cropped up. And what I say at the beginning of the book is I compare. It was actually my last day doing ethnographic work in the field at this school. I just had this light bulb moment, exactly the one you just had, where I walked into the dean of students' office and I asked them, hey, I feel like I overlooked something. Can you tell me what the process would be for a student facing campus discipline for drinking alcohol underage? And what they told me was, well, they would immediately be put on suspension and be removed from their classes until we had decided what to do. They would not be allowed to enroll in other classes. We would put a hold on their transcript so they couldn't transfer and they couldn't avoid accountability for what they've done. And if we do find them responsible, and that's the language that we use in civil proceedings, is responsibility is the same as guilty in that setting. But if we do find them responsible, then we're going to make sure that that's noted on their transcript moving forward, and future schools know why they were removed from this campus. When you compare that to Title IX, they would tell me, when it's in the context of sexual violence, that none of those things are allowed, that we have to postpone judgment, that even though there is a victim who could be facing harm for the entirety of that waiting period, well, that's just a reason that this is more serious. And that's one of the things that started to feel really confusing to me and just mind-blowing to me while I was in the field, is I would hear people over and over say, well, we do this and we treat sexual assault differently because it's such a serious crime. It's such a serious crime that we need to have a higher bar and we need to move slower. And I feel like if we're being rational, it should be the opposite, which is because the stakes are so high for another student, we should move faster. We should be more protective of that victim. Somebody drinking alcohol on campus, in my view, that really is a victimless crime. That's something that an individual person chose to do with their own body. As long as they chose to do it on their own, that's their decision. And if they didn't choose to do it on their own, I don't think they should be in any kind of disciplinary trouble for that. And the idea that that's the one that we have to be really careful and protect the campus community, it doesn't make any sense. It's completely backwards.
Right. We have to protect the community from someone just, going back to their room and throwing up, having a headache the next morning. Yeah, that's really, I feel really scared. The thing that, and of course, I don't mean to undermine, there are some people who get alcohol poisoning, wind up in the hospital. I mean, it can be very bad, or they can put other people's lives at risk, but it is by and large a victimless crime. And so it's like when people learned about the cult on the Sarah Lawrence campus and that it existed for years and people were being tremendously abused and being kept from medical care, from psychological care, and everything was right under campus's watch or nose. But there was nothing in place for when someone takes advantage of somebody else. And that should be where it should be easiest to jump in and just say, here are our safeguards. Now let's try to figure out what happened, but let's put them in place first. It's really incredible how you're really on your own.
It seems obvious. And part of how a lot of those cases involving cults, or again, those serial perpetrators, even if they don't create a full cult dynamic among their victims, they have a lot of victims, many of whom are on campus at the same time and are constrained at the same time. One of the issues that comes up is that school administrators really are reluctant to take any kind of action for a case involving one victim and one perpetrator. So the first victim comes forward, and this is often when the perpetrator isn't very practiced yet. Maybe they're They're not as intermeshed in the campus community. And so they don't have friends in high places yet. And so the first victim comes forward. They're able to successfully launch an investigation. And the school feels ambivalent. They feel a little ambivalent where they say, well, we think he might be a nice guy. We think that we want to believe people can change. We're an institution of education. Don't we think that education is the best response? Let's give this person a second chance. He might have done this, but this is the first time. Let's give him a second chance. But what that means for the original victim is that they are still forced to share space with the person who harmed them. And so that's a horrible outcome for them, that they still have to look over their shoulder. Often their perpetrator feels emboldened. And through the process, they can make friends in high places. Now they've probably sat down with the dean of students. Now they've sat down with the Title IX staff. Now they have all of these people who are on their side. And I actually got to see a case like this, where a serial perpetrator, one of his first victims when he arrived at campus reported, they decided to give him the second chance. He'd made all these friends in high places. And then future victims who tried to come forward, first of all, didn't have faith in the system because they already knew about him and they knew no one was doing anything about him. But even when they did try to report, the school was reluctant. And they had created this conspiracy theory that the original victim was just spreading rumors and that everybody was reporting the same thing, or that people were out to get him, because now they saw the first victim as a false allegation. They saw her as that vengeful, hysterical woman who was trying to cause harm, which is not who she was at all. That was a massive mischaracterization of her. But it led the school to say, well, we think we're going to look the other way. We're going to look the other way. We're going to look the other way. And for the entire time I was on campus, all of the school administrators knew that this perpetrator had been accused. They knew that there were multiple victims coming forward. And ultimately, he was never investigated again because it hides in plain sight. And that's exactly how things hide in plain sight, is that we don't believe the first victim. We don't support the first victim. And a lot of that doesn't come down to the evidence of the case at all. A lot of that just comes down to when there's one victim and one perpetrator, school administrators see it as, well, they don't think that one is important enough. They think, why would I sacrifice one person just for the benefit of the other person? And that is really the way they think about discipline. Instead of thinking, this is somebody who is violent, who does not maintain the values of our institution, that we don't want him to graduate and have a diploma with our name on it, because that's not the kind of person we want to be associated with. We want people who share our values. Instead, they say, well, one life has already been ruined in the victim. Wouldn't it be a shame to ruin a second one? Why don't we save the person who we can save? Which requires putting a lot more suffering on the victim, because there are natural consequences of sexual assault and they have to be borne by somebody. If they're not borne by perpetrators, they're borne by victims. And then the perpetrator then is in a position that they're more powerful now. They're more capable of perpetrating now. And I think, out of all the things I saw in the field, that was one of the ones that really stuck with me the most and upset me the most, was the idea that it isn't just that these systems are failing victims, but they're actually tangibly benefiting perpetrators and giving them more power to perpetrate in the future. And now I look at these stories of open secrets and cults on campuses and, all these things that everybody knew about, but nobody did anything about. I look about it from a totally different way, where instead of thinking, why was nobody doing anything if everybody knew, is it really that hard? Is it that complicated? Now I think, well, it's the fact that everybody knew is why this could continue the way it did. Is that it was an open secret and that the perpetrator is just that powerful now, because that's what they were able to do when somebody tried to come forward, was consolidate more power to perpetrate.
Right. Right. I think about, I'm trying to be nonpartisan in what I'm about to say, but I think about people in politics who have women coming forward and saying, this person did this to me, and having case after case either thrown out or, it does embolden, it does make a person feel above the law. And if they're prone to acting in very entitled and or dangerous ways, then yeah, you're creating more of a monster. I mean, it's also, I think, not at all true that people are saying, well, we shouldn't be so quick to judge this, like we have to raise the bar, like you're saying. So that means that we need to not judge too quickly. Well, they're already judging from the beginning. They're giving the perpetrator latitude and a chance to prove something about themselves. And they're deciding that the victim matters less and what that person went through matters less. And so there's already a decision that's been made, and it is in favor of the perpetrator from the start.
Yeah, there's no such thing as neutrality in these cases. And it's something that a lot of people, that's what they say. I want to be neutral. I don't want to take a side. I don't want to be judgmental. But there is a power dynamic between victim and perpetrator. And so if you remain neutral, the perpetrator will win every time, because that neutrality allows them to continue to keep their competitive edge in that power dynamic. And there are a few examples from the book that come to mind on this, but the one that comes to mind the most visibly is around something called a no contact directive. So no contact directives, up until very recently, were not required by any Title IX regulation. This is something that schools made up on their own. And they, in many ways, mimic a protective order from the criminal justice system, or a restraining order, people might know them as. But they're a little different. So if you get a no contact directive from your school, victims will be told that that's the way to keep your perpetrator from talking to you or about you. So you can't talk to the other person. You have to leave them alone and give them space, but you also can't talk about the other person. Now, for a victim, if this were unidirectional, where the victim has this protection from the perpetrator because the perpetrator is violent, they are the one who needs to be constrained, they are the one whose behavior cannot be trusted to be safe, then it would be really helpful for a victim, especially one who's trying to come forward, who's afraid about something like retaliation, because we don't want the perpetrator to continue to harass them or stalk them. It might stop the violence, but also one of the things victims worry about is what the perpetrator will say about them behind their back. And so to say you can't talk about the victim, you can't talk about the case, you can't say defamatory things about them, that's a really crucial protection for victims. But schools apply it neutrally. And they literally don't make a distinction between the two people. They call them party number one and party number two. And they often don't tell the victims until after there's already no contact directive in place. And then they say, by the way, this applies to you too. You can't talk about your perpetrator. You can't talk to your perpetrator. You cannot be in the same space as them. And so the impact of this is really different, because what perpetrators do when they violate no contact directives is they are often continuing violence. They're retaliating victims for coming forward, or they're trying to disparage the victim or interfere in the investigation. Whereas when victims would violate no contact directives, they were doing things like warning other future victims that this person is violent. They were trying to gather evidence, specifically in the forms of other people who'd had similar violent experiences with the perpetrator. Or they were trying to advocate for themselves and try to explain why their behavior was a little unusual or why they couldn't be in the same place that the perpetrator was. There was one victim who was threatened with expulsion because one of her friends started dating her perpetrator. And she tried to tell her, this is the person who harmed me. I'm worried for you. And also, if you do decide to date him, don't bring him around me. I can't be around him because he was violent towards me. And she was threatened with disciplinary proceedings for that. And so, yeah, this idea of being neutral and saying, I won't take a side and I don't care, it very quickly turns, when it comes from institutions, into enabling the abuse. Because what the perpetrator could do is watch the victim. And every time the victim tried to do something to resist the abuse, they could report that as a violation. And the other thing I'll say about this idea of neutrality, and I just don't, I want to give the perpetrator a chance. I don't want to be unfair to them. Studies are pretty clear that when researchers, they'll do these things called vignette studies or audit studies, where they'll have basically like fake job applications, and they will show them to research participants and say, would you hire this person? Why or why not? How much money do you think they would deserve? Justify that. And one of the scenarios that researchers have studied is turning in the exact same CV, so exact same qualifications for the two people, but one of them was the perpetrator of sexual harassment and the other was the victim. And what we find is that people are more likely to hire the perpetrator and recommend a higher salary for them because they say they need a second chance. Everybody else is probably against them. Don't they need somebody looking out for them? Whereas for the victim, they're seen as a troublemaker, as a liability. What if it wasn't true? What if they're just somebody who overreacts? They seem dangerous to our workplace. I don't know that we want this person here. All of this neutrality always produces the same outcome. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's the perpetrator being emboldened, being more powerful, getting more power and privileges, and the victim losing out on all of those things and losing their social status and their ability, their autonomy, their ability to protect themselves and care for themselves in society.
So maddening. So maddening. So how do we, and I want to be able to hear more stories. I'm just wondering, and this I might be like the $24,000 question, but how do we understand this sociologically? Why does that happen over and over again? And I've seen it. I've seen the victim finally coming forward, knowing it's going to be like pushing a boulder uphill, and it's probably going to come crashing back down on them, but they're still hoping to get some sort of justice and get some support. That then they're seen as the squeaky wheel. It's like, honor killings. Like the woman who was raped has brought shame on her family. Not the people who did it to her. They're fine, but she needs to be disposed of. And so what do we learn from that just about how society looks at perpetrators, victims, or maybe how they look at men and women? I mean, I'm just seeing this disparity, but I'm seeing it happens in so many different crevices of the world, but all over the world.
I think one of the persistent myths that you have to believe in to treat victims that way is that the victim is forever tarnished and there's no chance of repair, so that they've lost value from the sexual assault. And there are ways that people talk about this that sounds nicer than others. We'll start with the harshest one. The harshest one is thinking that once you've been sexually assaulted, you are damaged goods. You are less valuable as a partner, as a person. You're too traumatized to hold specific roles anymore. There are all these things you're incapable of doing, which is a horrible thing to think. And it's not empirically accurate. I want to be clear about that. The more generous, the kinder, sort of softer edges version of this is something like the harms of sexual assault can't be undone, and that victims are forever harmed, which to some degree is true. It leaves this scar. Violence leaves a scar. But the idea that victims are less valuable, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the things we're learning about sexual violence is that how traumatic it is not determined by the violence. Sexual violence and how traumatic it is largely determined by everything that happens after it's over. And I want to give a couple of examples of this so that you can wrap your head around it a little bit. So we know in the research, one of the reasons that we talk so much about women as survivors is because in the research, we find that women find sexual assault to be more traumatic than men on average. Among men, there's sort of this binary in how traumatizing they find things that meet the legal definition of sexual assault. And a lot of that has to do with the context of the violence and whether they lost social value as the result of the violence. So, for example, child sexual abuse of boys is equally as traumatic as child sexual abuse of girls. And that's because they're in this subordinated position. Once they have been sexually abused, they are losing value. Their social status is shifting in a negative way within their family, among their friend groups. When they try to get help, people won't believe them. They'll question their masculinity. That's traumatic. In contrast, we see that in cases of sexual violence happening in places like fraternity hazing rituals or military hazing rituals, if there is sexual violence there and the victim is then accepted into the ranks immediately afterward, and they are told, welcome to the Marines, welcome to this fraternity, you are now one of us, men tend to find that violence less traumatic. And again, it's not across the board. There are certainly people who are still traumatized by it. And a lot of those victims tend not to stay in those organizations. Even if they are accepted into them, the violence is too damaging. Their humanity has been stripped from them. But I say this not so much to enter a conversation about how traumatic is sexual assault for men, as much as to question whether sexual assault needs to be this traumatic for anyone. That if we value victims if we treat victims not just as equally valuable, but as more valuable, and if in the aftermath of violence we say, we care about you, we want to do the right thing for you, we want to support you, we want all of your needs to be met, and we're not going to ask you to keep pushing your own needs aside for the sake of your perpetrator, there's a good chance that violence would be less traumatic at all. And in the research on victims of all genders, we see that through something called institutional betrayal. That this idea of institutional betrayal was created by a researcher named Jennifer Fried. I cite it so extensively in the book. So if you have more questions about it, read the book. There's so much information about institutional betrayal in the book. But what she finds is that when a victim experiences violence and they come forward for help, if they get help, they will have fewer traumatic symptoms in studies in the future than victims who experience this institutional betrayal, which she defines as institutional actions or inactions that exacerbate trauma. And there's a list of them at the beginning of the book. They are things like not believing the victim, not thinking that what happened to them is serious, valuing them less, thinking their value at the institution is less now that they've experienced this, responding to their report badly, responding in ways that make violence seem like it's inevitable or it could happen to them again. And we know that when victims encounter these harms, which are really common, and they are all about devaluing the victim, that they will be more traumatized. And it's not in a small way. Victims who experience institutional betrayal, the best way to put it is that their traumatic symptoms increase in equal severity to the original assault. So another way to put this is that a victim who's experienced institutional betrayal looks as traumatized in studies as someone who was sexually assaulted twice in a row. So it's a very big deal. It's a very big deal. And this is part of how I think we start to think about this differently, is that I think that a lot of people really do believe that, it's too bad what happened to the victim. This damage is done forever. And there's nothing that we can do. And I think when people feel that helplessness, and this is, again, my most generous read, but when people feel that helplessness, they look to where they think they can help. And a lot of the time they look to the perpetrator because they think there's nothing I can do to ever fix this for the victim. I will never get a glowing review from the victim that says that I did such a great job, which I heard a lot in my field work with school administrators, and I don't think it's true. I just want to say that. Victims are actually quite quick to give out praise when they get support. And if you meet their needs, which is a very possible thing to do, we shouldn't be doing it for the praise. We should be doing it because it's right. But the idea that you can never make them happy again is just dishonest. But people who had that mindset of you can never make a victim happy, they would concentrate all of their energy onto keeping the perpetrator happy. And I think a big part of undoing that thinking and undoing that damage is to really think about how can we do something to help survivors? What can we do to make this less damaging to them? And let's put our energies there. I think it would go a really long way.
It's so powerful. And as you're talking about this, I'm also thinking about how I did this whole webinar that's on my website that I put together for people who had been involved in cultic groups or had gotten involved with a really manipulative partner or situation where they were really taken advantage of and snowed, manipulated without their knowledge, without their consent. How to present that story so that you're not immediately dismissed as having been gullible, as having been foolish, and also for the loved ones, especially parents, who will say, "Oh, my child got caught up in a cult," or whatever. They're blamed as parents. Oh, I would have raised my kids differently, where they would know not to blah blah blah, and they wouldn't believe this. And what's wrong with you as a parent? So there's just this constant knee-jerk reaction to put the blame back on the victim. So there's this whole thing that I talk about with them about how to tell your story so that the listener is really clear about who's at fault and who isn't. Because you have to spell it out. You have to push it in people's faces because it's unnatural, it seems, because we're so conditioned to go, well, really? But, And I think so many people are also posturing like, oh, I would have known. And, there must be something wrong with you. And so I think people are just overcompensating for their own insecurities about life and about themselves by responding that way, right?
That's exactly right. There's an entire long literature on this so before we were talking about people that are taking the side of the perpetrator in this really overt way. And yeah, I think it's good now to be talking about people who are trying to control the victim and are trying to distance themselves emotionally from the victim, because that's another way that victim blaming rears its ugly head. one of the studies I cite a lot about this is you would expect that in a sexual assault criminal trial, that if you had a jury full of women, that would be a good thing for a victim who is a woman. And it's not. It's not. That the more women who are on a jury, the less likely there is to be a conviction. And the reason researchers have come up for to explain this is that when we identify with the victim, we try to emotionally distance ourselves because the reality of living in a patriarchal society where sexual violence can happen to you at not any time. Researchers know there are, it's predictable. It's not completely random, but for the general public, it can feel completely random, but that it's something that can happen to you no matter how careful you are, and that there's nothing you can do about it, that it's not your fault, so you can't change that outcome. It makes people feel really unsafe, especially people who view themselves, if they originally identify with the victim, it makes them feel unsafe. And so for women, we see this more often. And so what they'll do is exactly what you're describing. They will blame the victim. They will come up with a list of reasons why they would know better than the victim, and it could never happen to me. And I want to be clear, they're not correct. Sexual violence is at its core a crime and a trauma based on a loss of autonomy. And so the idea that any of us can be smart enough or good enough to never lose our autonomy, that's not something you choose. That's not something that you enjoy. It's something that happens to you that's out of your control. And that's why it feels so dangerous. So it doesn't work. I want to be clear about that. All of these sexual assault prevention tips that we throw around, all of these tips we have for people to avoid, X, Y, and Z, they don't work. And if they did, we would have seen that in the literature by now. We would have seen that these tips would have reduced the sexual assault rate. And the sexual assault rate on college campuses in particular has not changed at all since we started measuring it 60 years ago. It has stayed completely stagnant. And so everything we're doing around prevention and putting all of that blame on victims and telling women this is what you have to do to stop, it's not working very well. And I want to be clear, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to put some caveats on this, which is that women are actually pretty good at resisting sexual violence to a point. And that's part of the issue, is that if we are in a scenario where we feel and can perceive, and we're allowed to act, that we don't like that person, they're being pushy, they're, interrupting us a lot, they're touching us in ways we don't want. I always think about this in sort of a party scenario where somebody is interrupting you, they're talking over you, they're doing things that make you uncomfortable. If you're allowed to leave, while it's still easy to leave, women are really good at that, actually, as long as nobody pushes you and pressures you to stay. But all these tips are focused on the moment right before the violence would start. And by then it's far too late, right? That then you've already lost a lot of the tools at your disposal to resist. And there is some research that suggests that better education about coercion and being able to witness coercion can help. But again, there's some limits, because a lot of the times when we're resisting coercion, people tell us we're being impolite. They tell us that we're not being deferential enough, especially, I think about this a lot in the context of family violence, especially when the perpetrator is a father and the victim is a daughter. The idea that you're supposed to be subservient to your father and respect his authority, it's really hard for a kid in that position to push back about that. It's really, really hard to resist. So anyway, a big part of this is that the entire way we think about sexual assault prevention is victim blaming. And so a lot of people, when they react this way, they think they're doing the victim a favor. But really what they're doing is projecting their own anxiety about violence onto the victim and trying to get that distance. And one of the things we have to do better by victims, and this I really say to women who are listening, is we just have to sit with that discomfort of the reality of our society. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It might make you feel better in the moment, but whether you're blaming other victims or blaming yourself, it actually makes violence more likely. It can increase traumatic symptoms. Self-blame is one of the strongest associations with how traumatic someone finds a sexual assault. And so we all have to resist that temptation to tell people this is what you should have done differently. Because if they walk away from that feeling like what happened to them is their fault, first of all, it's not true. And second of all, they are much more likely to develop conditions like PTSD than they were before you made those comments. And so we need to stop. And we need to think a lot more about what would be more effective at preventing sexual violence. And I think it's tough because we want to believe that we think about sexual violence a lot in this one-on-one dynamic where we're the victim, they're the perpetrator. How can I, in that scenario, still be safe? But I find a lot more hope in a sociological approach. That's why I became a sociologist. But if we think about it from that perspective, thinking about less, how do I stop my individual perpetrator, and think about more of when I'm the one in a position of power and authority, what can I do to support other survivors and take away power from their perpetrators? Then the solutions become a lot more clear. I got this really great question from a book club recently where somebody said, what do we do about cases where, you reported, the school did nothing, and your perpetrator is still offending? And this is something I feel really strongly about. If you weren't able to stop your perpetrator, that is not your fault. If you didn't report, I don't want that to be a shame or a burden that you carry with you, because so many of these institutions, you could have done everything exactly right and they still would have refused to intervene. And you as the victim, the power dynamic between you and perpetrator is so significant that if you could control their behavior, you wouldn't have been violated. The whole point is that you can't. And so it's not on you. If the perpetrator reoffends, that's them. That's their decision. And the institutions that give them the power to do it, it's on them and their decision. So when we see ourselves primarily through the view of a victim, that's my response. My response is, it's not on you. And unfortunately, there's very little you can do about it. But if we think about it from the perspective of now I'm the professor in a classroom, and I know that the perpetrator and the victim are both taking my class that semester, well, now I have a lot more power. Now I have a lot more power to do something. And so one of the incredible gains we have made in the feminist movement is that there are women in a lot of workplaces now. We are in a lot of positions of power. And so I want us to take those positions of power that we have and think about how we can use those instead of telling victims who are powerless to pretend they have power. Let's look at the power we actually have and use the power we actually have to protect each other.
Oh, I love that. I wish we had so much more time to talk. And hopefully we can talk again, because I think this whole idea of the people blaming the victim, but also the victim blaming themselves, if they can kind of get into, as you're saying, aligning themselves with this powerful position, this, what happened to me was wrong, and I can be very clear about it, and I have backup. I have other people who I respect, who have a certain amount of power, who are also seeing it that way, who are not going to be throwing me under the bus and confusing the issue. I think it is so, so important. And also just learning about consent. A lot of the research I've done recently about consent and finding out that just because you gave consent at the beginning doesn't mean that you're still responsible for how things changed, or that you were suddenly locked in a room. That doesn't mean you gave consent just because you agreed to go on a date with that person who's now doing this to you. I mean, just understanding what is in play and what's also now being created that is out there I wish it were less paltry, but it's still something that is in place to show you that you had some rights really all along the way, but people don't think of it that way. And that's also not the way they're responded to. And so it is really, really important that you're doing this work. Where can people find your book or anything else that you're doing where you're educating the public?
Yeah, the book is called On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. It's available wherever books are sold, and I really recommend getting it from your favorite indie bookshop, but anywhere is good. If you love it, please leave reviews. I'll say that especially for feminist work, it's a matter of time until the trolls appear and try to tank the reviews. And so it's nice to get out ahead of it. And so the more we can do that, please do. In terms of finding me, I'm mostly still on Twitter, maybe alone. Maybe I'm the only one left, but on Twitter and Blue Sky these days. My handle is nbedera, Nbedera at both. And if you work at an organization and you are feeling kind of moved over this idea of using the powerful positions we hold to make spaces that are more supportive of survivors, that are more comfortable with accountability, we're doing a lot of anti-violence consulting these days. And our group is called Beyond Compliance Consulting. We would love to work with anybody who is really committed to ending violence, not just doing the bare minimum of ticking boxes with what you have to do with being compliant with the law, but the people who really say, even if we're not legally mandated to meet that bar, we want this to be a safe place. And that's who we want to work with. So I would love to hear from any of you who are listening.
Wow. Okay. I hope the listeners all heard that. I'm sure they did. And I'm sure this has been riveting for everyone listening. And for me, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to have such an important discussion. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And everyone check out the book, but also connect with Nicole and see if you're needing that kind of support. And if you want to offer your support to this cause. I mean, this is all very circular. And it's really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. One more thing before you go. Wow. So every once in a while, I interview someone for this podcast, and what they talk about gets my blood pressure up, my blood boiling, even more than usual. And part of the reason that I do this work and I care about these issues is because they deeply impact me. Some of these stories, though, when I hear about the injustice and I hear about the institutionalized injustice and the institutional behavior, like Nicole spoke about, it's something that just keeps running through my head over and over again. And I find that when I take notes, as I take notes when everyone is talking, with the subject that Nicole covered, I was looking over my notes to record this outro, and there's so much that I put in boxes, that I put in caps, that I put stars around. And I thought these are such important points. They permeate so much of what is wrong with our system, and that is so disempowering of the people who have been harmed and so empowering of the people who do the harming. It is quite incredible to come across what happens on campus, on college campuses. I think about my own college campuses and how much took place where things were really hidden. Things were pushed under the rug. I went to a school with many, many students. And I know there are things that happen to people at the hands of some of the male students, maybe some of the female as well, but a lot of them who were athletes on campus, people who were very full of themselves, or people who hadn't really ever gotten in trouble before and felt this kind of, I'm better than you, I am unable to be taken down, kind of overly confident. A lot of the people who walk around overly confident walk around that way for good reason. They have every reason to be overly confident. When you get away with something over and over again because the system is built to protect you as the perpetrator, then the system keeps empowering you to become more and more emboldened, to become more and more entitled, to become more and more like a monster. And to also feel incredulous, kind of this righteous indignation if you are given any amount of responsibility for your crimes. I remember one time sitting around with a group of guys, and they were talking about their girlfriends, talking about their wives. And it was actually incredible how much they felt comfortable dissing, putting down the women in their lives while I'm sitting right there. I was sitting there because I was waiting for some friends to arrive. And so it was at one of these restaurants where it's like long park benches and you all sit together. So while I'm waiting for my friends to arrive, I happened to be with a group of about 7 or 8 guys who were all out. And it was amazing to hear how one after the other talked about their girlfriend or their wife being crazy or having gone crazy, or being overly dramatic, being manipulative. And it really was kind of astounding to see how they did not hear themselves. Oh, she's just crazy. Yeah, so I did this and so I did that. But, she didn't have to react that way. She could just be more chill about it. God, she just goes crazy, or she drives me crazy. Or then she cried, those tears where she just was trying to, of course, manipulate me. And so I thought, I'm probably never going to see these guys again. And they clearly have a lot of growing up to do. But I thought, all right, I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to say something. And I just said, do any of you study statistics? Which got their attention right away. And one of them said, actually, yeah, as part of my studies, I do study statistics. And I said, okay, let's look at this. I don't actually need to jump into your conversation. I was just sitting here listening. But how many of you are there? 8 people, and all of your girlfriends or wives have gone crazy or are crazy or are constantly manipulating you. Statistically speaking, how probable is that? And I looked at the guy who studies statistics, and he did not know what to say. So I said, maybe it could be that is a way for you to protect yourself from having to take responsibility for anything you've done that might make your girlfriend or wife upset. If you can just discount her as crazy. Or if you can say that when she's having a reaction to you, she's trying to manipulate you, then you don't have to change. She's the one who kind of has to get it together. And she's the one who has to be more, quote unquote, chill. And I pointed to the guy who used the word chill. And because I was a bit older than them, I think they felt like they might have needed to listen. So I said, actually, it might be good if you listen to yourselves while you're talking, because none of you sound impressive. And they didn't quite know what to do with that. And they said, why are you talking to us like this? And I said, because I feel like not enough people have. And one of them said, what do you mean by not impressive? So I said, if you want to actually come across as impressive, you would say the following. You know what? My girlfriend or my wife gets upset with me a lot. She might have some issue. She might have stuff from her childhood. But it could be that I might be doing something that's really making her feel betrayed or pissed off or disempowered or something. I want to take a moment to look at that before putting all the blame on her, because if I just keep putting all the blame on her, I'm going to sound like a child. And I'm going to sound like I'm saying something like, oh, my mom drives me crazy. Or my mom is a lunatic, because that's how you sound. And then my friends arrived, and I just turned and I left. Not enough people hear that message. And I did take a chance. I knew I was in a public space. And I did feel a bit protected knowing that my friends were about to arrive. And I actually didn't feel scared of them at all. I think they were letting off steam, but they didn't hear how much they were potentially part of the problem. They just automatically needed to turn and have it be someone else's fault. When it needs to be someone else's fault right away, then you are dealing with someone who doesn't have confidence. You're dealing with someone who doesn't really know how to be in the world in that way that is that kind of strong and quiet confidence that shows maturity, that is that kind of personality where there is that kind of reflection, where you're willing to look, where you're willing to see your side in it, your part in it, where you don't just have to play this sort of emotional hot potato and just throw this into someone else's lap and have them be at fault. I think when we look at how many times people who are abused, men and women, don't come forward, or how many times they delay coming forward, and how many times then the focus is on them for how they reacted and that they didn't react somehow the right way to being hurt, we then see that there's so much wrong with our system. We see the gaps in our system. It is built in, unfortunately, to society. And in some countries that are really not even as far along as the United States is in this way, women really don't stand a chance. At least here they have a chance. But it shouldn't be such an uphill battle. It shouldn't be such a fight to be believed. It shouldn't be that the system built in to protect you betrays you. I'm so glad that there are people like Nicole who are willing to be out there telling these stories, who are willing to shine a light. I also know that I am wishing that this were going to make as big of a difference as I wish it could. And I'm sure she feels the same. But this is an ingrained part of our culture. And we really need to look at it. We really need to see how we are creating monsters, how we are making people feel they can do anything they want. And until we're part of trying to change that system or look at it or doing our part, we just can't sit back and be shocked that it is this way. So if there's a way for you to be involved, if there's a way for you to educate people, if you're a teacher, if you're a sociologist, if you're a therapist, if you're a parent, if you're anything, teach people, if you can, about the fact that so often our perpetrators are made to look like the victim in the story and that they're being victimized by the victims, and how wrong that is. Thank you so much to Nicole, and thank you to everyone out there who is trying to bring a light to this subject that has existed in the dark for way too long. Talk to you next week. Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.